Hey there, folks. Clyde Chester here. And tonight I want to tell you about one of the strangest, most genuinely bizarre events in American history. A day when meat literally fell from the sky over Bath County, Kentucky, covering a farmer's yard in chunks of flesh that seemed to appear out of nowhere. I'm talking about the Great Kentucky Meat Shower of March 3, 1876, an event so weird that it made headlines across the country, baffled scientists for years, and still gets debated today. This is a story about mystery, about the limits of scientific knowledge, and about what happens when reality gets so strange that nobody knows quite what to make of it. Let me take you back to March 3, 1876, to a farm near Rankin in Bath County, Kentucky. This was rural Kentucky, tobacco country, rolling hills and scattered farmsteads, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and life moved at the pace of the seasons. On this particular Friday, a woman named Mrs. Allen Crouch was in her yard making soap. Now, making soap was hard, physical work in 1876. You'd render animal fat in a big kettle over an outdoor fire, mix in lye, stir for hours until the mixture saponified into something you could actually use for washing. It was hot, smelly, exhausting work, but it was necessary. This was farm life, and you made do. Mrs. Crouch was standing there, stirring her soap kettle, when suddenly, and I mean suddenly, with no warning whatsoever, chunks of meat started falling from the sky. Not rain, not hail, not birds dropping things, meat, actual flesh, falling from above like some kind of biblical plague. The pieces ranged in size from tiny flakes to chunks as large as 4 inches square. They fell in a strip about 100 yards long and 50 yards wide, covering Mrs. Crouch's yard and the area immediately around her house. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The whole event lasted maybe 2 or 3 minutes, and then the sky was clear again. Nothing falling, just Mrs. Crouch standing there covered in mystery meat, trying to process what the hell had just happened. Now, Mrs. Crouch ran to get her husband, Alan, who came out and saw the meat scattered all over their property. He picked up some pieces, examined them, sniffed them. They looked like raw meat, felt like raw meat, smelled like raw meat. Some pieces appeared to be muscle tissue, others looked fatty, some seemed to have bits of cartilage or connective tissue. It was definitely organic matter, definitely flesh of some kind, but where it came from and why it was falling from the sky was a complete mystery. The Crouches weren't the only witnesses. Several neighbors saw it happen or saw the immediate aftermath, confirmed that yes, meat had fallen from a clear sky, that this wasn't some kind of hallucination or hoax. One of those neighbors was a man named Harrison Gill, and he made a decision that speaks to both the scientific curiosity and the somewhat questionable judgment of 19th century rural Kentuckians. He tasted it. That's right, Gill picked up a piece of the mystery sky meat, put it in his mouth, and tasted it. According to reports, he said it tasted like mutton or venison. His friends apparently joined in this impromptu tasting session, and they all agreed it seemed to be some kind of animal flesh. Now, before we judge Gill and his friends too harshly for eating mystery meat that fell from the sky, remember that this was 1876 rural Kentucky. People were used to butchering their own animals, used to identifying meat by sight and smell, and yes, taste. And the meat was fresh. It hadn't been sitting there long enough to spoil. So from their perspective, if you wanted to know what kind of meat it was, tasting it made a certain frontier logic sense. Still, looking back from our modern food safety conscious perspective, it's absolutely insane. Don't eat mystery meat from the sky, folks. That's good advice for any era. Word of the meat shower spread quickly, as you'd imagine. By the next day, people were coming from surrounding farms to see the phenomenon. They collected samples, took pieces home to examine, talked about it in town. Within days, the story had reached the newspapers. The New York Times ran an article about it on March 10, 1876, under the headline, "A Shower of Flesh," treating it as a curiosity, but also as a genuine mystery worth investigating. The story spread across the country. Newspapers from Kentucky to California reported on the strange meat shower, and scientists started paying attention. The Bath County News, the local paper, sent samples of the meat to various scientists and institutions for analysis. Several experts examined the samples, and this is where things get really interesting, because the scientists couldn't agree on what it was. Dr. A. Mead Edwards, a Newark, New Jersey physician, examined samples and concluded it was lung tissue of a horse or possibly a human infant, a disturbing and bizarre conclusion that didn't really explain anything. Leopold Brandeis, a chemist, analyzed other samples and determined it was lung tissue of a horse or some other animal. Another analysis suggested it was cartilage and muscle tissue, possibly from a lamb or deer. The Scientific American got involved, which was a big deal. This was the premier scientific publication of the era. They published an article in their March 1876 issue examining the Kentucky meat shower, and their explanation became the one that most scientists eventually settled on: vultures. The theory was that a flock of vultures were chircling high above Mrs. Crouch's farm, and they'd recently gorged themselves on a carcass somewhere. Vultures, when threatened or when they need to take off quickly from a full stomach, will regurgitate what they've eaten to lighten their load. So, according to this theory, a flock of vultures flying over the Crouch farm had simultaneously vomited up chunks of partially digested carrion, which then rained down on Mrs. Crouch's yard. This explanation had the virtue of being at least theoretically possible. Vultures do regurgitate. It's a documented behavior. And if you had enough vultures all vomiting at once from high enough altitude, you could potentially get a localized shower of organic matter falling from the sky. The theory explained the confined area of the fall, about 100 by 50 yards, which matched what you'd expect from birds flying in a flock. It explained the mixed nature of the tissue. If the vultures had eaten from a carcass that included different body parts, the regurgitated material would be mixed up. But here's the problem. Mrs. Crouch reported that the sky was clear. She didn't see any vultures. Neither did any of the other witnesses. Now, vultures can fly very high, high enough that you might not easily see them from the ground, especially if you weren't looking up at the exact right moment. But nobody reported seeing a flock of large birds overhead before, during, or after the meat shower. And you'd think that a flock of vultures enough to produce that much regurgitated meat, we're talking about covering 100 by 50 yards with chunks of flesh, would be pretty noticeable. There were other problems with the vulture theory too. The meat that fell was fresh. Witnesses described it as like freshly butchered meat, not partially digested carrion that had been sitting in a vulture's stomach for hours. If vultures had regurgitated it, you'd expect it to be more degraded, more digested, mixed with stomach acids and partially broken down. But the samples examined by scientists showed relatively intact tissue, muscle and fat and cartilage that looked like it had come recently from an animal, not from a vulture's digestive system. Alternative theories emerged, some more plausible than others. One suggestion was that a water sport or a small tornado had picked up debris from a butchering site or a battlefield and deposited over the Crouch farm. This could theoretically explain fresh meat falling from the sky, but there were no reports of unusual weather that day, no water sports or tornadic activity. Bath County in early March 1876 had clear, calm weather, so where would this hypothetical water sport have come from? Another theory suggested that the meat had been carried by high-altitude winds from some distant location, maybe a slaughterhouse or butchering operation, and deposited over Kentucky. But this doesn't really work either. Meat is heavy, and chunks 4 inches square wouldn't be carried by normal winds for any significant distance. You'd need hurricane-force winds, and those leave other evidence: knocked down trees, damaged buildings, general destruction. None of that happened in Bath County that day. Some people suggested it might be some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, a weird meteorological event that science didn't understand. In 1876, meteorology was still a relatively new science. Weather forecasting was primitive, and there was a lot that scientists didn't understand about atmospheric processes. Maybe there was some unknown mechanism that could cause organic matter to condense in the atmosphere and fall as precipitation. This was speculative to the point of being nonsensical, and no serious scientist really endorsed it, but it showed how desperate people were for an explanation that made sense. The skeptical voices suggested hoax, that Mrs. Crouch or someone else had fabricated the story, scattered meat around the yard, and invented the tale of it falling from the sky. But this doesn't hold up to scrutiny either. Mrs. Crouch had no apparent motive for such a hoax. She and her husband were ordinary farmers, not publicity seekers. The event brought them attention, sure, but not the kind of attention most people would want. They had scientists and newspapermen and curious neighbors tramping through their property for weeks, and there were multiple witnesses who saw the meat falling or saw it immediately afterwards, people with no reason to lie or participate in a hoax.
The mystery deepened when you considered the chemical analyses. Different samples produced different results, suggesting the meat came from different types of animals or different parts of the same animal. Some tests indicated lung tissue, others muscle, others cartilage and connective tissue. If this was all regurgitated by vultures who'd eaten from one carcass, you'd expect more consistency in the tissue types. The variety suggested either multiple sources or a very thorough consumption of a single carcass that included many different body parts. Interest in the Kentucky meat shower peaked in 1876 and then gradually faded as no definitive explanation emerged. Scientists published their analyses, newspapers ran their stories, and eventually everyone moved on to other mysteries. The vulture regurgitation theory became the accepted explanation, more or less. It was the best theory anyone had, even if it didn't perfectly fit all the evidence. It went into the books as a weird but explainable event, a quirk of nature that had a scientific explanation, even if that explanation required some squinting and ignoring of inconvenient details. But the mystery never completely died. Over the decades, the Kentucky meat shower became a favorite topic for people.